Hello there. Thank you very much for coming and listening to my latest story. I'm Huw Carr. Please, it will help this channel a lot if you push the like button, share the story with your friends, and if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. Remember to push the notification bell so you're always up to date with every new story. And now, on with the tale. Trouser Wasps. From the biography, The Grand Mr. Grande. Written and read by Huw Carr. In May of 1945, Mussolini's grand vision for an empire with Rome again at its center had come to naught. The Germans had surrendered their Italian campaign, and 4 months later, after the catastrophic destruction of 2 Japanese cities by atomic bombs, the Second World War came to an end in the September. Yet the minds of so many young Italians were still full of the pride that Mussolini had instilled. Italy would still need an army. It no longer marched to the clamor of steel. It paraded more quietly and with less gaudy trappings. Still, when it called the sons of farmers to serve, the summons could not be ignored. Romano Grande's time came in 1947. He didn't complain. It was easier than life on the farm. In the summer, it was time for harvest. Romano and his uniformed friends could march about, laugh, court pretty girls, and on the whole feel good about the freedom from serfdom that farm life meant. The war was over. There were no more ragged German soldiers with haunted eyes approaching on the horizon. The sun was bright, making even the rubble of farmsteads ruined by artillery shelling seem less sorrowful. The mud and dust of the farm was off his skin. Or so he thought. Word came that his mother was dying. The bright sun dimmed, making the world of laughing with chums seem painfully far from home. Romano's commanding officers were not without compassion. They offered him a leave of duty to return to Villa San Giovanni on the condition that when he had mourned her loss, he would return and complete his service. The future didn't seem as important to Romano as he raced home, praying that she could survive long enough to know he was there to be with her at her end. She had been there at his beginning. His duty seemed clear. When he returned to the village, it seemed alive with a bustling hive of activity. He could not understand how the whole community wasn't solemnly hushed in sadness, harvest or no. He should have known his father's cunning better. Romano found his mother was very well, thank you very much, impatient for him to join in on the harvest. His father Nicola waved away his son's astonishment at her miraculous recovery.
"Was she never ill then?" he asked sullenly. "Was it just a ruse to get me home?"
Nicola countered.
"The designs of armies are between men alone. God made men honest by farming. That should be good enough for you."
"I'm in the army now, Father,"
Romano protested.
"The only reason I got to come back at time was because Mother was sick. She's not sick at all. I will have to go back."
Nicola wasn't going to lose another laborer so easy. He wasn't fool enough to set himself against the army alone, but the village marshal was on his side.
"You don't have to send him back to the army, Nick,"
the marshal laughed.
"I can give him an extension for another 2 weeks.
Romano realized he was trapped. Army or no, he couldn't escape the farm or the dictatorship of his father. Assured that his leave of absence extension would be verified, he grudgingly returned to the grueling days of farm labor. He could endure it for 2 weeks. At the end of that time, he returned to his barracks, thankful he was no longer Romano the farm labourer, but Romano the soldier and servant of his country. Reporting for duty, he found out he had earned himself another name. It was Romano the deserter. His commanding officer rejected his extension. Protesting that the marshal had promised he could stay longer, he learned that he was in fact required to have returned first to the barracks to have his leave extended. There was no point protesting. Prison awaited him. Stripped of his clothes and possessions he brought from home, he was sent to H Division to serve 1 month of hard, solitary confinement. There were no blankets in the cell, and his shoes, one stuffed inside the other, served as a pillow. Shivering and sleepless, the nights passed. The rumor came to him that because he was labeled a deserter, he would have double the normal time allotted in compulsory service as punishment. Shame and anger mixed with misery. He had relied on the word of the marshal, and it had been worthless. No one was coming to his defense. No one worried about one man wronged. Locked in a tiny room, he thought and railed and wailed and grew close to despair. An honest trust in the system had failed him. Honesty could go hang itself. Romano knew full well that when his time in solitary was over, his punishments were only beginning.
"When you get out, Grande, you won't walk anywhere," his captain declared. "You run. Every day you will run for 30 miles, until you learn what it is to be a deserter."
All at once, his life in the army was transformed. Images of his home, his father's farm, his mother's cooking filled his mind. Suddenly, farm life didn't seem so bad. Hard as it was, the retribution his captain would pile on his back would be far worse. He lay on his cold cot, wondering if they would send him back home when the strain finally broke him. Somehow, he had to escape. One day, he heard the clip-clop of a horse approaching, accompanied by the ring of a bell. A man with a cart had come to collect the refuse from local restaurants. Buzzing over the cart were a swarm of wasps, eagerly feasting on the leftovers. Romano called to the owner of the cart, begging him to come to the small window that looked out onto the street.
"I want to buy your wasps,"
Romano called to him. The rubbish man from the cart looked at the building, wondering whether it was an insane asylum.
"You want to buy wasps?"
he questioned, before the notion occurred to him that the insane's money was as good as anyone's.
"How much for?"
he asked. Romano had been allowed to keep the money he had brought from his home. There was nowhere the regiment could reliably hold it, and as he was in solitary, there was no chance of it being stolen.
"I will give you £10 per wasp, if you can procure for me 4 or 5.
"For £50 you can have 6. Consider the last bonus,"
beamed the rubbish man. He thought, formed a question in his mind, and then immediately rejected it.
"I am not going to ask what you want them for,"
he said, catching and storing them in a cigarette tin pierced with holes. The buzzing package was exchanged for £50. Romano kept the figs he was given in his daily ration, slicing them up and using them to feed the wasps. In a week, his solitary ended, and he returned to his barracks, hiding the tin away. Late at night, while his comrades slept in the bunk above, he crept carefully, step by step, to his case and retrieved a single wasp from the tin. Opening his trousers, He slipped the miniature winged warrior into the hair below his belt, biting his lip as it stung him wrathfully again and again. Its assault done, he returned it to the tin and passed the night with a throbbing groin. In the morning, the captain arose, ready to deliver the first of the penalty runs to the deserter. He found Romano limping to him, clutching below his belly.
"What's so wrong with you?"
he growled.
Captain,
Romano moaned.
I feel terrible, like I have a hernia. I've never had a hernia before. I can't understand it. Look.
Romano pulled his trousers down, revealing the mad red swelling. Aghast, the captain lost a lot of his wind, inwardly wincing.
"That looks terrible. All right, I'll give you 1 day's rest. We'll see how you are tomorrow."
Romano thanked his captain gratefully, not relenting on his exaggerated, painful shuffle as he returned to the barracks. In the evening, his compatriots returned from their run, hot and exhausted, to find him already happily in bed. But in the night he returned to his case, stealing sleep from another wasp, who angrily expressed its indignation on Romano's groin. The next day, the swelling was worse than before. After 3 or 4 days of rest, with no reduction of the livid swelling, the captain was reluctant to have a soldier suffer needlessly. He ordered that Romano be transferred to the hospital in Bologna, 200 miles to the northwest. Romano tapped his little treasure tin. He hoped they'd last the journey. After all, they'd had a rather intimate relationship together. He knew, too, that once he got there, the military doctors would be harder to fool. The regiment doctor signed off on his medical report, and he was sent to Bologna. Thanks to the WASPS, his initial examination on arrival confirmed the diagnosis. The swelling suggested he should be operated on as soon as possible. He was sent to a ward, and due to the fact that he would soon be under the knife, he was to have no meat. Romano sat in his hospital bed, watching the delicious steaks being served up to his fellow patients. Some were too sick to eat them, or too tired from operations of their own. So Romano removed them from the guilt of wasting those fine cuts of Italian beef, and scoffed them for himself. Along came the professors in their white coats, ordering the dropping of trousers. Fearing that they might need more convincing, Romano had most vigorously applied the living stilettos of the wasps the night before.
"Oh, jeez!"
one professor exclaimed.
"This is about the worst hernia I've ever seen."
They chattered among themselves, using a lot of daunting words.
"All right, Romano,"
they said, patting him with what they hoped were comforting looks.
"We'll see you in a couple of days."
A couple of days was all he had until they discovered him. They would whisk him away, open him up, and find nothing wrong at all. They would want to find out where they had gone wrong, and then they would discover that they had been made fools of. A doctor who has been made to appear foolish was a dangerous thing in civilian life. In the army, well, he would be very sorry indeed. 2 days later, he was being wheeled into the operating room. In the big mirrors on the roof, he could see just how terrified his own face looked. The doctors thought he was afraid of the surgery to come. He was afraid of what they would find, or rather, fail to find inside him. Romano thought the anaesthetist in particular looked like he had a very short temper. Tears welled up inside of him.
Please, professors, don't open me up. I'm afraid,
he lamented.
"We need to repair this hernia, Romano,"
the doctors replied. Romano thought fast.
I haven't told you something,
he said in his meekest, most contrite voice.
"What is it?"
they asked, perplexed.
My mother has only got me, her only son,
he wailed, temporarily eradicating his 3 brothers and father in a single moment of inspiration.
and I got this here in the army. If something happens to me on the table, so far from her, how will she cope? Alone in the world. Isn't there some way it could be done closer to my home, so I can be closer to her care?
The doctors conceded.
Yes, of course it is. But here in the army, the operation is for free. Why burden your poor mother with the cost?
Pleased with his last refurbishment of the truth, he continued decorating.
Oh, it doesn't matter. She's a wealthy woman. But all her money will mean nothing with no son to look after her when she is too weak.
And she is lucky too, he thought to himself, to have a son who can ruse his way right out of this den of white-coated lions.
If that's what you insist, Romano,
the doctor said, thinking the strain had been too much for the little man. He had seen all manners of injuries wear a man down, and this man was so small he hadn't got far to go.
We can give you a form to release you to civilian medical care. But if the war starts tomorrow, you'll be called up just the same, provided they don't mess you up so badly you can't carry a gun.
He was wheeled back to his bed and waiting wasps while the papers were prepared. There was only one hurdle left to hide his missing hernia. Back in his room, a doctor explained.
You'll have to see the Professor Colonel for a last visit. He might approve of you. I warn you, Romano, he's a hard man. I wish you well, but I cannot promise this is the last you will see of us.
Romano wondered whether he could conjure up a visit from Mary in the night, but thought they might be pushing it too far. At night, he gave his groin a good pumping with the wasp's stings. The day came. Romano was made to line up with the other soldiers awaiting inspection by the Professor Colonel. Each of them were at least 3 foot taller than him. He felt very small. When it was his turn, the big, stern-faced colonel called him by name.
Romano Grande.
Yes, sir,
Romano replied and stood before the man.
Aha,
said the colonel, and pierced him with a knowing eye. Oh, God, he knew all about it. Romano ran through a series of weeping apologies in his mind as the big man motioned for him to come closer. Perhaps falling to his knees and begging might work.
What do you mean, Grande?
The big man boomed.
Grande is big. You're just a midget. I couldn't see you standing there among the other men.
Romano found his heart had started to beat again.
Drop your pants,
the colonel ordered, and proceeded to inspect the area.
Good Lord, this is advanced, he cried. Why on earth do you want to go home when it is as bad as that?
Relating the tale of his supposedly pitiful mother, he embellished her sufferings with a few more fictional woes for good measure. Not even putting a finger on him, the colonel decided to send him home again. Romano considered kissing his hand, but then concluded that that was probably overdoing it. Arriving at last back at his regiment, he presented the colonel's papers to his captain. His captain read them in surprise.
Oh, you're going home?
Pretending to be sorry, Romano moped.
My poor mother will be sorry with what I have, but at least I'll be able to see her.
He was sent to his bunk to strip off his uniform and shoes and dress again in civilian clothes. His comrade, Antonio, who shared the top bunk, stuck out his neck and laughed mockingly.
So, Romano, the father of your wasps, eh?
Yes,
Romano said, keeping close.
Such is life.
Back at his home at last, he came clean to his brothers. They agreed that he had had no choice but to use his wits to gain his freedom. After all, Romano's escape had happened at the perfect time. His brothers Antonio and Umberto were leaving Italy to begin the greatest adventure of their lives. Their father was returning to Australia, and they were going with him. Thank you very much for listening to this latest story. This is from a biography that I wrote, so the characters and events in this story are real. I hope you take the time to look at some other stories on this channel, and also please, please, please share these stories with your friends. Next time, we'll have another spooky story, a classic by Edgar Allan Poe. And so until then, look out for the shadows.